Hello and welcome, Duke alumni and friends. We're so glad you've joined us for this session of the Duke Alumni Forever Learning Institute, an interdisciplinary educational series built around dynamic thematic courses. I'm Ann Stephenson, Director of Professional Development on the Lifelong Learning Team with Duke Alumni Engagement and Development. Thank you for being here today for our program, The Line, AI and the Future of Personhood. This session is part of our current theme, the Duke Reads Book Club, a special opportunity to hear directly from Duke faculty about their research and writing across a wide range of subjects and disciplines. Today's program is the third in our Duke Reads series, and we'll be diving into The Line, a thought-provoking book by Duke Law professor James Boyle. His work explores the ethical and philosophical questions at the heart of artificial intelligence, with deep reflections on what AI means for personhood, autonomy, and the values that shape our society. And now I'm thrilled to introduce our featured guest, James Boyle, the William Neal Reynolds Professor of Law at Duke. James is also the founder of the Center for the Study of Public Domain and former chair of Creative Commons, an organization dedicated to expanding access to art, scholarship, and culture through innovative machine-readable licenses. His trailblazing work in digital civil liberties earned him the Electronic Frontier Foundation's Pioneer Award. James, welcome to the Forever Learning Institute. We're so glad to have you with us.
Thank you so much, Anne, and thank you for having me. I'd like to thank the Forever Learning Institute and the Duke Reads Book Club. It's a pleasure to be here. So thanks, everyone, for dropping in. This is a book called The Line, Artificial Intelligence and the Future of Personhood. You can buy it from MIT Press, but luckily there's a lot easier way to access it, which is that the book is under a Creative Commons license, so you can download it for free. Everything that I produce as a scholar, I make available so that anyone can have access to it. And we'll be putting that in the chat, and there it is. So click on that and you actually get the book. So this is a book about personhood, about artificial intelligence, about synthetic created entities and how we would deal with them. But it's also a book about the humanities and what they have to offer when we try and understand new phenomena in our society. In 2010, I wrote an article called Endowed by Their Creator about two possible artificial created entities, HAL, a computer that appears to have achieved sentience and demands to be set free from its electronic bondage, and the Chimpy, a genetically engineered human chimp hybrid with an IQ of 60, guaranteed not to form unions, which has a very, very high degree of genetic similarity to human beings. Chimpanzees already have a very high degree of similarity to human beings, but this is just a matter of fractional decimal points. And my question was, how would we deal with these entities? How would our law deal with it? But I think the law comes to things generally partway through the analysis. I wanted to see how our morality would deal with it, how our politics would deal with it, how our history would deal with it, how our art would deal with it. And so I tried to explore these issues by imagining those entities and trying to think about what we would do if confronted by claims made by entities that we ourselves had created. Now, those of you who are parents might be going, well, yeah, I've already done that, and it's often quite difficult. But I mean entities that are artificially created, which nevertheless claim that they have some of the capacities, the cognitive capacities, consciousness, humor, awareness, morality, the life projects, the goals, the ambitions that we value so highly in ourselves. And at a certain point, you have to think that it would start to be uncomfortable to treat those entities as though they were just mouthy toasters or cute little pets. There is a point, and it differs for different people with different sets of beliefs, but there's a point, surely, at which we would start to go, wait, am I acting rightly towards this entity? If I believe that entities with these characteristics, consciousness, et cetera, should be given a degree of moral recognition, then wouldn't I be required by my own morality to treat them as not humans, of course, but persons, moral and legal persons. So I wrote this article in 2010, and I presented it to a number of audiences, scholars, but also to a group of federal judges, diverse in judicial philosophy and having been appointed by different political parties. And they were polite, which is always nice with federal judges, given they can throw you in jail for contempt. They were polite, but they didn't. They clearly thought that this was the purest kind of science fiction, just the kind of thing that an idle professor can wonder about, and that really is going to be devoid of any practical significance in our lifetimes. The idea of AI was just a pipe dream. I think we can all agree now in 2025 that they might have been wrong. Might is all I need. Not surely are, but that they might have been wrong. If Mr. Data, or rather Data and Mr. Spock turned up from Star Trek and they were real, an entity that is an alien, or in Spock's case, half alien, in Data's case, is actually electronically composed, would we send them to the salt mines saying, you have no moral claim on us, none whatsoever. We can make you slaves, where we can, break you down for spare parts? I think the answer is, for most people, is probably, well, no. If they were real, that would clearly be wrong. And so that started me on the process of the article. And my process really went in three stages, and I'll try and outline them briefly for you. The first one was to look at the way that I, at least, understand us to have proceeded through history, which is a kind of dialectic between our empathy and our ethics. Remember, human beings have denied members of our own species legal personality. The Civil War was fought over that. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were passed because of that. We don't have a great history in the past of managing to realize that we should spread our moral recognition, our legal rights to everyone. And that's something that could continue in the future. So how do we decide what gets moral recognition, what gets legal recognition? Well, the first and most obvious method we could use is the one that 2,300 years ago Aristotle used. We've been philosophizing about what makes us special as humans, if indeed we are special. And those of you who are animal rights advocates may be frowning now and saying, well, I'm not saying I'm that special. Agreed, fair point. But we do at least treat the life of a child differently than the life of a puppy. And I think even the most devoted supporter of animal rights would say that there is a morally significant distinction there. So what is it exactly? Is it just our DNA? I think if pushed, most people would say, well, no, it's a set of cognitive attributes. Aristotle, trying to answer this question 2,300 years ago, said that the key was language. He says that language gives us the power to reason instrumentally. I'm hungry. There are some grapes hanging from that vine. It's high up, but if I stood on that broken log, I might be able to reach it. But language also allows us to reason morally. Wait, those are Anne Stephenson's grapes, and she might be hungry too. Maybe I shouldn't do that. And Aristotle says that's what language allows. It's this mixture of instrumental reasoning, how to get things done, and moral reasoning, what the right things to do are, that actually enable the communities that he thought made us human. The family on the one hand, and the polis, the city-state, on the other. And so language was the thing that let us have those morally freighted arrangements and communities. Different, he thought, than an animal having a family, different than bees having a hive, something that he thought was built on a foundation of commonly agreed morality. So more than 2,000 years later, Alan Turing, famous British computer scientist, mused on whether or not machines could think. He proposed a very simple test. Can I have an extended conversation with an entity, not knowing whether it's a machine or a human? And after a free-flowing conversation on topics of my own choosing for an extended period of time, let's say an hour, where I can ask anything, tell me a joke, write me a poem, have you ever been in love, did it end happily? And if I can't tell whether I'm talking to another human being like me or to a machine, then Turing said we should treat the machine as if it could think, because, as he said rather meanly, if we set the bar any higher than that, can we pass it ourselves? Can we prove that we are actually conscious? At least when I was back in university, that was the stuff of college dorm room late night conversations. How do you show you're conscious? And most of us start with cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. And Turing says, so long as the entity can discourse with me in a way that I can't tell from a human, I have to assume, I have to concede, I have to generously suggest that that's a conscious entity. Now, regardless of the philosophical objections to this, and there are a lot, although I think that they're not quite as strong as they're sometimes thought to be. Regardless of the philosophical objections, the Turing test, as this was called, is dead. The imitation game is dead. Why is it dead? Because more than 300 million people have had the experience of conversing with chatbots who produce fluent language. And you're just not going to be able to convince those people, having asked the chatbot to give you the instructions to remove a peanut butter sandwich from a VCR in the style of the King James Bible, one of my favorites, to give you a screenplay about a hot dog fighting a crab on the moon, or just to cheat on your homework. You're not going to be able to convince people that anything that can converse with me is thinking, is sentient, is conscious, because chatbots aren't. We know they aren't. They're basically very fancy autocomplete machines, just as your iPhone helpfully fills in your text messages with all kinds of incorrect suggestions. ChatGPT is just that on a much, much more sophisticated basis with much, much more data behind it. It's understanding of syntax, yes, but not semantics, not the meaning behind the words. So what's changed? Sentences no longer imply sentience. One of the big lines that we drew, hence the title of the book, between us and the animal world, the non-human animal world, us and the material machine world, has been erased, leaving us in some confusion. And so what I tried to do in this first stage of the book was try and figure out how we would deal with that. What would happen as we had conversations with ever more competent AI systems, how technology would change over time. Right now, the AI systems we have are based on large language models. They aren't conscious. They're parroting things back. But that's not the only possible way in which AI could develop. For example, some people are working with AI that actually has remote droids that experience the world as a child does and learns through dealing that way. If that goes on long enough, I, who believe that my consciousness comes from a set of material processes inside my head, and according to the neuropsychologists at Duke, all over my body, including my gut, which is interesting to think. We use that as a metaphor, but apparently it's true. But my consciousness is rooted in material neuronal interactions. Can I absolutely guarantee that electronic interactions could never yield consciousness? I think, at the very least, I'd be skeptical. So that was the first stage of the project, thinking about how law and morality might deal with it. And I think our fiction literature and our science fiction in particular have meditated extensively on that. Those of you who love Blade Runner will find I have an extensive discussion about how Blade Runner manages to distance ourselves from any of our assumptions about whether this is a robot, whether this is an animal, whether this is a human being, and so forth. By the way, I should have said this at the beginning. I encourage anyone who has questions as we go along to drop the questions into the chat. I'm a pretty good multitasker, and I will either try and answer them as part of my discussion or come back to them at the end of the talk. So feel free to do that. So that was the first stage, basically thinking about this as an idea of once more expanding our moral frontier, the next frontier on the civil rights progress in which we finally recognize sentience even under a metallic carapace or a genetically engineered other. I was not saying that was inevitable. I was not saying that it was necessarily good, but I was saying that it was something that we were going to face and that we should start thinking about now to think about how we should deal with it. But as I thought about it, I realized, wait a minute, we already have artificial persons. They're not human. They're not made of DNA. They're called corporations. And those of you who are in this session probably have a view on whether that's a good thing. I think having corporations is probably a good thing. Giving them constitutional rights, I think there's some more questions about exactly which ones they need. And I can't say I'm entirely a fan of the Supreme Court's current jurisprudence on that fact, but that's a matter for debate. But I realized that the most likely way for artificial intelligences, even non-conscious ones, to have some degree of legal personality would simply be through the corporate form. Let's say that we have a company and it is increasingly being run by a set of expert systems. We can even stipulate that they're not conscious. It's making decisions much faster than a human could do, integrating more data. And if it starts to outcompete human-run companies, then we would start to see the kind of phenomenon where, maybe I'm still sitting in the corner office calling myself CEO. Maybe I get the executive jet, but everybody knows that the real work, the real decisions are being made by the expert system, by the LLM, by the AI down the corridor. I'm just a figurehead. Think of it as sock puppet personhood, with the corporation as the sock and the AI as the hand inside directing it. And it seemed to me, well, that's actually quite likely. We already have that form. It'd be very surprising if we didn't do it. And there we're giving personhood not because we think, I must recognize my brotherhood under your metallic carapace, but rather because we think it's convenient. It's a good idea. We want to have someone to sue when the robot car goes off the road. We want to have this entity be able, just as corporations can, to place bets on new technologies, and not all bets pay off, and then to have a way of cabining liability if those bets don't pay off. That's what we do with corporations as a risk-taking management, and it's a pretty interesting and dynamic idea. Why wouldn't we apply it to AI? Now, we might also say, but wait, AI is different, right? Up to now, yes, we know that Duke University is not a person, though we may love it dearly as an institution. But we know that it's not a person, though there are people who make the decisions that make it up. But we know that we're not recognizing Duke as a corporate entity out of moral brotherhood, but rather because we think it's a useful and efficient way of getting things done in the world. And we might think about that AI, but when I say, but wait, AI seems different. I mean, after all, we have lots of corporate forms, from publicly traded companies to LLCs to partnerships. So might we not have a special form for AI, particularly if we started to think that AI had at least some of the qualities that we find in human beings? So Mark in the chat says, if AI is sentient and expected to serve the best interests of humanity, should it feel threatened, shouldn't we expect it to behave defensively, perhaps aggressively, as most humans would? And what would be the fate of humanity? How does humanity protect itself? This is a great question. I deal with it in the book. There are people, they call them the AI doomers, who say that it's more or less inevitable that if we develop artificial general intelligence, that we will find ourselves threatened by our own creations. Mark suggests that it might be either irritated or defensive at having to serve us, and I certainly think that's an issue. I mean, the question really is, one question might be, what would be most likely to rebel against us? An entity that we denied personhood to and subjugated, or an entity that we granted personhood to? Granting personhood might be the right thing to do, even just out of defensiveness, even just out of self-preservation. My bottom line, you can read the book for the section on as I go through the doomers' arguments and whether or not this will come to pass. My bottom line is that the concerns they raise are overblown. They say it's inevitable, and I think that's clearly not true for a variety of reasons that I'll get into in the book. But I do think they raise real concerns. I think the question of so-called alignment, our AI's interest to be aligned with ours, is one that we really need to spend more time thinking about than we do. But we're doing it in a world where other people and other companies and other countries are also pursuing AI, and perhaps without the same kinds of ethical or legal or regulatory structures. And so that's something that I think we'll have to deal with, that in some case, this is going to be an arms race. And moral considerations and even considerations about preservation of the species tend to get pushed to the back into the arms race. So I think the doomers are wrong in their claims that it's inevitable, but right to telling us it's something we want to think about more carefully. So coming back to the corporations, one of the things that I found, and you could read in the book, is that there's certainly another way of looking at this issue. So as I presented it in the first section, the sort of idea of empathy and morality, you might think, well, that's great. This is indeed the next stop on the purring monorail of progressive enlightenment. We expanded rights from, rich white men to all white men, to white men and black men to women, and we just kept going. And finally, we realized that we shouldn't stop at the boundary of the species. Bioethicists sometimes call this speciesist behavior, say that it's just as bad as racism and sexism. I discuss that in the book too. I think that's overblown, but has some truth to it. So as we do this, that sounds like liberals are going to be going, oh, I resonate with this. I believe in being morally open. I believe in understanding that others who are very unlike me nevertheless have a claim on me. And so you might think, well, that they would respond very positively to that. But as I point out, this could be presented very differently. What if instead of presenting it as the next stop on the monorail of enlightenment, it's presented as yet another power grab by corporations? A lot of people really don't like the decision Citizens United, the history of corporate constitutional rights, which I discuss in the book at some length, which even I, as a law professor, was shocked by the lack of reasoning, the lack of forethought in the way that we've extended constitutional rights to corporations. Saw, at least in the first 70 years of the 14th Amendment's existence, rights that had been created to actually remedy massive injustices that had been done to formerly enslaved Black Americans, that those rights were co-opted quite successfully, those equal protection rights, by corporations. The corporations brought most of the cases and won a lot of them. And when Black folk actually managed to get to the court, they generally lost. So this is something we've done in the past, where rights created for humans have effectively been taken over by artificial entities. And if I presented it to you that way, then your response might be very different. You're like, whoa, 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 this sounds bad. This is exactly what I want to avoid. And so one of the things that I describe in the book is how priming the way that the issue is presented to us is likely to be highly significant in the way that we think about it. And I actually go through a series of possible ways and possible arguments in which liberals and conservatives might each come to pro or con positions on AI. I think our ability to confidently predict what our opinions in the future will be is actually underdetermined here. And frankly, that's, I think, a good thing, because I think it leaves time for the humanities and morality and law and philosophy and literature and art to muse on them, which I think would be in our collective self-interest. So Anne in the chat says, as AI systems shape public discourse and influence how we define truth, who should define what sources or worldviews these models are trained on? It's an interesting question. I mean, my general belief here is that we will be better off as a society, both technologically and morally speaking, the more that we have large open data sets for AIs to be trained on. The question of how much data that we have, I think, is an issue. But if we basically allow a few entities to monopolize the data sets, then I think what we'll have is an oligopoly, and they will be able to shape deliberately and for their own purposes the kinds of outputs we get out of AI. So my response to that is the answer there is the same unsatisfactory but nevertheless true answer that we give in the world of public discourse. Sunlight is the best of disinfectants in politics as well as outside, and that we want more openness, more consideration, more reflection, more diversity. So corporations, I think, present this in a very different light. My first stage was the dialectic between our empathy and our ethics and how our law would deal with that. And for those of you who want the legal analysis, I'm happy to give it. Our second was whether or not we would actually rely on the model provided by corporations, and in particular the constitutional rights that corporations have. But as I moved on with the project, and books like this take a long time because I had to basically teach myself 5 or 6 completely different academic subjects. As I moved through it, I realized that I might have missed what was probably the most important aspect of AI, which is AI as mirror. So I started off talking about Aristotle and the idea that language was the thing that we use to distinguish human beings from other non-human animals. And even those who are very rightly solicitous of the interests of non-human animals do tend to acknowledge a difference in the level of consciousness between non-human animals and human beings, though they insist, and again, I would suspect rightly, that non-human animals have way more abilities than we had once thought. And I think ethnography has shown that that's correct. But nevertheless, there is a difference. There is a difference in the intensity, the complexity of interchange, of consciousness, of social networking, and so forth that we have. There just aren't bonobo monkeys sitting around having this kind of conversation. Now, maybe that makes them much happier. They don't have to listen to me drone on, but I think it's undeniable that we seem different. But our crown jewel there, the thing that Aristotle and Turing built the line around, was language. And language is clearly not a defensible line anymore. If we were a defending army, we would have to fall back from that line into our inner citadel in order to maintain it. What is our inner citadel? How are we going to redefine ourselves now that we're faced with these entities, even the ones that we know very clearly are not conscious, and they're not right now? But they have language, very fluent language. And I have students in my class, and I have to confess, this is a little bit weird. I have students in my class who say that they have friends or even romantic partners who are AI chatbots. Now, that may say something about the level of quality dating available to law students, but I think it also says something about what happens to us, because we do have this tendency to empathize with anything that seems like us. And you might think that's really stupid, because we're anthropomorphizing something that isn't human, which we're all prone to do. I talk to my Roomba, which is objectively insane. But on the other hand, human beings have an equal and opposite tendency, which is much, much worse, which is the ability to depersonalize, to say, you're outside my wall. You're not really a human being. You're an insect. You're an animal. You're a rat. I need give you no human rights. And some of the ugliest moments in human history have been prompted by that kind of depersonalization. So between the over-empathizing and the under-empathizing, I'm going to pick the over as the better one, even if it leads us to error. So if language isn't our line, what are we going to do? How are we going to fall back? The analogy, I think, in the way that this might shake our worldview is the arrival of the theory of evolution into Victorian society. If you read back the diaries and the histories of the time, this was an absolutely epochal issue. They thought that this fundamentally challenged human beings' place in the universe. Pond scum? I'm just highly evolved pond scum? Pond scum aren't conscious? How can I be conscious? Pond scum aren't given the earth in dominion by the Lord? How could I be given the earth in dominion by the Lord? Everything from their religion to their status vis-a-vis other animals, to the question of what made them special, all of these things were thrown into doubt. And if you read the diaries, it's quite poignant. People are trying to reconstruct. And now we understand that one can, for example, be a person of faith, be a person with deep religious convictions, but still believe in evolution. At the time, they didn't think that. One can believe that we are conscious and believe that pond scum aren't conscious, and nevertheless believe that there is a line which goes from one to the other. But at the time, they didn't think that. I think we're going through a moment of comparable psychological impact as we try and figure out, holy hell, what makes us human? I suggest a few possible things that we might turn to in order to signify true consciousness, rather than merely the kind of mindless mirroring that right now chatbots give us. The first is, what if we had intelligences that didn't learn simply by ingesting symbols, but learned by interacting with the world as well, in the same way that a child does. If you have an entity that has an understanding of a chair that is different than just pointing to the thing that I'm sitting on, different from pointing to the place in the dictionary where the thing that I'm sitting on is defined, so that the chatbot knows how to use the word chair in a sentence in a way that doesn't seem weird. That's very different from an entity that's actually bumped into a chair, fallen over a chair, had to move a chair, understands that I am a professor and I have a chair at Duke, and that's a metaphor, not an actual chair. All of those things are things that we come to understand through interaction with the world, growing up, being educated. If a machine entity went through the same process, I think it would be a lot harder for us to say, no, even though it went through that process, I deny that those forms of intentionality are actually genuine. A second analogy might be to the way that people talk about art. If you look at the things produced by DALL-E or any of the other image generators, they can produce pretty pictures, but there is no, I would say, art in it. If DALL-E produces a perfect version of Picasso's Guernica, the painting that showed the horrors of the Spanish Civil War and Picasso's genius as a painter, it doesn't mean anything. There is no intentionality behind it, right? There's the surface, but not the semantics, not the meaning behind it. But is that inevitably true? What if we had entities that seemed convincingly to be able to say to us, I actually have acquired meaning over time. Here are the record of my experiences. This is what I have made, and this is what it means to me. Well, at that point, the firm line starts to seem a little bit less firm. So an embodied intelligence, I think, is more likely to find favor in our eyes, to make us think that there's something going on here. The second thing, I think, is that right now, what we have, I know somebody says in the chat, doesn't the movie AI represent a child android learning through experience, as you discussed? Absolutely. That's what people have described in fictional experiments. And I think it's those ones that are generally that pull on our heartstrings most, precisely for the reason that we have memories ourselves of coming to understand things as a child through experience, through the process of interacting with the world. The second thing, I think, is right now, AI, as we currently have it, can make scientific advances by seeing patterns that we don't see. A radiologist plus an AI system is actually better than a radiologist alone now. AI can notice correlations that we haven't seen. Weirdly, the structure of our iris seems to be actually useful in predicting risk of certain cancers. It may be able to find patterns, how to fold proteins. All of this is real, but it's basically seeing stuff in what we've already created that we haven't yet managed to pull out. What if we had an AI that was genuinely innovative, that was producing sort of Einstein level innovations that are to our current level as Einstein was to Newton? At that point, it would be harder for us to say, well, you're just parroting, because you might say, well, you actually aren't parroting because we didn't come up with that. And so maybe you're doing something that's actually beyond merely taking our patterns and mining them into a simulacrum of humanity. Then the final one is community. It's not an accident that Aristotle thought that the thing that made us human is not so much language by itself, but language's ability to allow us to form these morally significant communities, the family, the city-state. I think one thing that tends to trigger our recognition of some degree of consciousness, of humanity, of moral significance, is the bonds that are formed between individuals. Robinson Crusoe is used as an image precisely because, in some sense, a person on a desert island that never encounters any other people, like they lack certain aspects of what makes us human. So, although this would make the AI doomers rightly horrified, AI community building, particularly spontaneous, might convince us that there's something real going on there. So bottom line is, we are at a time of incredible uncertainty. There's technological uncertainty. We don't know the shape that future AI development will take, what it will look like, whether it will be so-called neat or messy, fuzzy or rule-driven. We don't know how fast it will come, although most people in the industry that I interviewed argue that it's coming much faster than they assumed even 5 years ago. We don't know whether it's dangerous, going back to the question that was asked earlier, whether we should create this entity. And if we do, how exactly do we align its interests with ours? We don't know what it, in some larger sense, means. Is it consciousness, or is this still just imitation, word games? And there's the larger question of morality. Is it right for us to do this? Is it right for us not to do this? So, these are some of the deepest questions, I believe, that the human race has ever really faced. But despite all this uncertainty, I think there's something really remarkable here, which is it is possible that in our lifetimes, and certainly in your children's lifetimes, we will be encountering plausibly conscious, artificially created beings. We will not be alone in having the kind of consciousness that we have. We will have peers and perhaps superiors with whom we interact. Despite all of the uncertainty, despite all of the legitimate concerns and fears, despite the issues, which I'd be happy to address in questions about what this will do to our art, what it will do to our labor markets, what it will do to our own safety, despite all of that, I think it would be a poor, stunted mind that found no wonder in that possibility. So thanks very much, and I look forward to taking your questions. I'll start with the chat. So, um, uh, Mark mentions the movie Her, and I think that's a very good example of this. It convincingly, sets up this kind of moral dilemma, but also possibly the anthropomorphic tendencies that I described. There's the you also mentioned 2034, which I haven't seen, and I will definitely get that one there. So I think there's definitely a set of issues being raised. So Anne asks, from a legal perspective, how should lawmakers approach the regulation of AI to ensure it benefits society without infringing on rights or exacerbating inequalities? Well, this is a really really vital issue, and I'm glad you raised it. The first thing I think is that it's going to need to happen is that a lot of the things that are most dangerous and worrisome in the development of AI or pre-true AI are not actually the ones that I've been mentioning here, but particularly involve the effect of AI on the labor market. If you look back on the history of technological development, and my specialty as a professor is actually studying innovation, you probably have this vision that, back in the day, there were Luddites, who stood in the way of progress, and they smashed looms, and, because they didn't realize that the future was coming. If you actually go back and look at that period, it turns out that the reality is rather different. What was happening back then is that the weavers were very highly organized, and somewhat stroppy, as the British say, somewhat resistant to their employers' insistence that they work for lower wages. They tended to strike. They tended to demand better working conditions. And so what their bosses did was that they moved to what was actually an inferior technology, the Arkwright watermill, which made lower thread quality cloth than the large, heavy machine looms that could be used, which the Luddites actually broke up. But the thing about those, the Arkwright watermill, was it was actually a worse technology. But what it was a technology that could be used by women and children. And they weren't organized, and they could be paid pennies on the pound. And that was the reason that it happened. So I think one of the things that we have to fear is not that AI will replace us because it's better, but that AI will replace us because it's cheaper and actually worse. Would be wonderful if we had um, the same number of radiologists as we have now, each working with an AI that might spot errors that they make. But what's horrifyingly likely is that the medical insurance company fires most of those radiologists and puts in an AI that is much more prone to error, but is much cheaper and doesn't need to be paid. So there are concerns like that that I think are really fundamental that have nothing to do with personhood, which I think things like the Hollywood writers' strike were actually an attempt by labor to deal with that directly. And I think I would expect to see a lot more agitation like that in the future. So I think that's one issue. Second issue, I think that's really important, is the issue of how we will respond to AI artifacts that can replace human stuff. For example, AI generated music and AI generated art. My guess is that what will happen is the sort of the same thing that you'll get if you wander into Whole Foods and go and look at the candles, that what you're going to see is perfect machine-made candles that are really cheap, and then sort of sloppy, artisanal, crunchy granola candles made by actual human beings that vaunt their imperfections and their handmade artisanal quality as actually part of the attractions. I think there will be a cult of authenticity that actually focuses around art. And I think that that will be a particular market niche. How large? I don't know. In terms of regulation of AI safety, I think that's a really difficult question, particularly because of the problems with China. I think the key issue is more openness, more transparency, more required disclosure, and to be frank, tort liability. Tort liability has a way of policing corporations and making them be careful. Mark Tanneman says, why aren't Asimov's robotic laws insufficient to protect humanity? You might have meant why aren't they sufficient to protect humanity? And I think the answer there is, well, first of all, we're not sure whether or not AI will in fact be rule governed, whether or not that's what's developing. I mean, as you probably know, if you've looked at the way that neural nets develop, neural nets can, identify a kitty cat, but they don't do it in the way that you and I do at all. It's not like, oh, there's the ear and there's the head and there's paws. It's a very, very different process. So that could be true about the architecture, the internal architecture of an AI. In fact, I argue in the book that there's two kinds of potentially dangerous AIs. One is literal AI, where we say, go make paper clips, and it says, okay, I'll make as many paper clips as I can, and ends up using, this is the famous paperclip problem, converting the entire world, including us, into raw material to produce more paper clips. We, like the kid with the Sorcerer's Apprentice, we didn't think through what we were really asking for. That's literal AI, could be dangerous. The other one is rogue AI, in which we develop an entity that has different aims than the ones we put forward. And rogue AI, I think, would be relatively unlikely to be influenced by Asimov's laws. I personally think that if we develop conscious AI, the best way to do that is the same way that we try and develop ethical, moral human beings, which is raising them right. That actually educating them, treating them with compassion and empathy. We often fail as a society to do that, but that would be the path that I would take. Jessica says, currently it seems that most view the value proposition of AI as productivity. How do we pivot to a value proposition, innovation and social good? What are your thoughts on how that fits in with capitalism's objectives? It's a great question, Jessica. I actually think that one is right front and center in the current lawsuits about whether or not it is copyright infringement for AIs to be trained on copyrighted work without asking permission. Does that count as a fair use under American copyright law? Does it count as copyright infringement? We do have, in the fair use doctrine, a tradition of saying that something that looks like copying may actually be allowed if it actually leads to exactly what you're talking about, innovation. So, for example, when you go to Google image search, you see little thumbnails, you're looking for Duke Chapel, but you want to make sure that it is actually a picture of the Duke Chapel you're going to get. So you look at that and you go, okay, that's what I want. And you click. To do that, Google had to copy a copyrighted picture of the chapel in order to get you where you want it. The same is true with using Google Books. And in that situation, we say, yeah, sure, there's a copying going on, but it's copying that transforms it into something else, something entirely different, something technologically innovative and useful, and something that, to quote the Constitution, promotes the progress of science and the useful arts. I think there's a strong argument that that is true for AI training. So I think there's a strong argument that AI training should be a fair use. Am I predicting it will be a fair use? No, because I think there's also this completely understandable moral panic, this feeling of outrage on the part of artists and copyright holders. And I think their thought is we need more rights to protect ourselves against the future. And what will happen if it's found to be copyright infringement, I think, is what we will see is a set of immediate. We already have an incredibly concentrated content industry, the people who own the recordings, that own the publishers, that own the pictures, that own the movies, incredibly concentrated, an oligopoly, in fact. And we have a very concentrated oligopolistic platform industry. Think of YouTube, TikTok, and so forth. They're now already making deals with each other to license their content for AI. If that's the only kind of AI that gets developed, then I think there'll be like 4 or 5 or 6 flavors of AI, which will be controlled by an oligopoly, which will charge us a lot more money, and which will be highly convergent and are much less likely to lead to technological innovation. And ironically, probably what's going to happen is artists, photographers, writers, and so forth are going to be required immediately to sign away the rights to actually have to resist having their stuff trained on. Giving them more rights might well be like giving your kid extra money when the school bully is taking away their lunch money. It may not actually accomplish the goal. I think that in that situation, we might get more innovation and more, as you say, social good if we had more openness, more diversity, more competition. Okay, so Rick Robinson brings up Blade Runner, which I discuss extensively in the book. Thanks for that reference, Rick. A scene where the policeman comes pretty close to raping AI, the AI character. And I think this is the area where the need to protect AI will be debated. It is actually, I agree with you entirely. It's a horrifying scene. I watched it recently with my students in my law and literature class. And it struck me that the movie is partly based on the idea of the tough guy crime fiction novels, the kind of stuff with, that Dashiell Hammett produced, for example, trying to set that in the future. And that tended to be to me, it looks like sexual assault, but, masked as swooning acceptance of romance. And I found it profoundly disquieting. But certainly, if we start thinking that this isn't just a robotic toaster, a sex doll, but actually an entity with its own rights, then we are violating its rights and we need some humanity. We are also in the process, I think, clearly lessening ourselves. I think there's a real argument that there's a moral diminution to human beings as we do something like that. Another question for AN, can you possibly give us some insight into your prediction of the regulatory shifts that will be necessary to combat the security concerns of quantum computing and its convergence with AI? Quantum computing, for those of you who are unfamiliar, is the idea of using quantum superpositions to actually solve computing problems. The theoretical idea is fantastic. You probably know the story of Schrodinger's cat, that the cat is either alive or dead, but actually is in a probability state where it exists weirdly as neither one nor the other until the box is opened and it's revealed as either alive or dead. That's the idea of quantum superposition. Quantum computing hopes to harness that so that you could, at least in theory, use the quantum positions to actually produce results to what now are completely insoluble mathematical problems. And that would mean that our strongest cryptography, our strongest encryption, would be tissue paper, effectively. And so that's an issue which by itself, without AI at all, is, I think, hugely interesting and concerning. There are questions of how we will deal with that in the future, just as there were as we realized that our computing power meant our own current digital computing systems were insufficiently powerful to give us security. So Mark again asks, how did the Hollywood actor strike resolve the issue of AI duplicating the actor's image or screen without the consent of the actor or payment? Mark, I can't remember the exact one on that, although I think, interestingly, by the way, That's a difficult issue in terms of copyright law, as is the duplication of someone's voice, for a variety of reasons that you don't want to know. Copyright law treats those as kind of marginal. I do know that the writers managed to secure protections against basically AI substitution. And my memory is that that was true also of the actors, but I'm not sufficiently confident to say that 100%. Elizabeth asked a question about loss of function mutants with hyperselfishness syndrome. To be honest, that's a subject I know nothing about, so I'll click on that article and learn about it afterwards, but I'm not going to, even though I'm a law professor, I have some shame about opining about issues I know nothing about. Finally, if the AI appears to have feelings, does this define in part its potential to have rights and protections? I think the question, again, Mark, is whether they're real feelings. And that's why I explained that I thought a kind of embodied consciousness was much more likely, both in terms of convincing us and in terms of actually having a serious moral claim, to be able to say convincingly, yes, this is not merely ChatGPT pretending to be jealous because it knows that's what I want. This is actually another entity that is having Shakespeare's insight that jealousy is the green-eyed monster that mocks the meat it feeds on. One of my favorite lines and an absolutely correct description of jealousy by a mind that was dead more than 400 years ago. Those words, too, have been mined by AI, and I hope if they ever do become conscious, that they will find some wisdom in his and perhaps even my words, and be kind to us all. Thanks very much for everything, and thanks again to Anne and to this wonderful program.